Hi. First, I'd like to introduce one of our Fair Mormon programs. Mormon Voices, which you can find at, I think, mormonvoices.org. You always have to make sure you get the right one of those. Is a program which helps respond to misrepresentations in the media. We know that from time to time, will be misunderstood, and an article may come out that has some factual errors, or sometimes even a perfectly good article comes out that needs some positive comments and encouragement in the comments section. And especially, the articles often need some input from people who have had the actual lived experience of participating in the church and living the gospel, and know what a good situation that really is. So if you'd like to participate, you can sign up at mormonvoices.org, and when there is a need that arises to either correct misrepresentations by courteously posting in the comments, or by or to support an article that's getting bludgeoned by those who don't like us, we'll send out an email encouraging people to come and leave kind, respectful comments. Now for our next speaker. Russel Stevenson has been interested in history since the time of his youth. He was influenced by the experience of engaging in frank and honest conversations on difficult topics with his father. And this, combined with the love of learning, set him on a path where he got a BA in history from BYU, a master's from the University of Kentucky, and he is currently pursuing doctoral studies at Michigan State University in African history. He's the author of several articles, as well as the book Black Mormon, The Story of Elijah Abels. He also hosts the Mormon History Guy podcast and is a member of Fair Mormon. So without further ado, Russel Stevenson.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be here with you today, and I look forward to discussing with you a rather sensitive topic in Latter-day Saint history. Yesterday, Brother Perkins gave an excellent discussion on blacks in the Scriptures. And today I look forward to building upon that conversation, as well as hoping to open up a few new lines of inquiries as well. I've entitled this presentation, Shouldering the Cross. And there's a reason for that we're going to get into later on. But suffice it to say that there is a fairly long tradition of discussing the origins of the priesthood band within the context of personal sacrifice, of a willingness to give up one's dearest principles for what people tend to believe was doctrine or a fundamental part of the church. The subtitle is How to Condemn Racism While Still Calling Brigham Young a Prophet. And obviously we're going to be discussing both what racism is and is not, as well as what it means to be a prophet, and perhaps how we can or perhaps should redefine that term. So a foundational aspect of this topic is understanding what it means to enjoy white privilege. Now, that's not something that Caucasians are typically used to thinking about, especially in Utah. The fact that a Caucasian would enjoy a level of privilege, if only because the African American population is so small. So it's easy to convince ourselves that it's a non-issue. But here's what it really ends up looking like. Caucasians feel entitled to define what is and is not racist. We like to think that, okay, this is what racism is supposed to look like. My grandfather, yeah, he was a nice guy, and he said some things, but he wasn't racist because I loved my grandfather. Now, one thing you need to understand about the Stevenson family is we love ourselves. All right, Stevensons are enamored with their past, their present, their future. I am fully convinced that if Stevensons were offered the opportunity to found a country of their own, they would jump at the chance. And we have a national anthem ready to go. So I grew up in a culture in which we were more than proud to invite people to our family reunions because we were just that good. Right? Come along and be a part of the Stevenson empire. But there was something of a dark underbelly to the Stevenson experience. And many of you may have had this similar experience in that we had a relative who entertained certain racial insensitivities. It was no secret. We all knew exactly what he believed about minority races, in particular African Americans. And on one occasion, a good man in our family, a man who was of high stature, we all respected him, he made some comments about this relative who entertained these racial sensibilities. Now, let me make it clear. We all held this relative in the highest regard. He was a well-respected man. His children turned out fantastically. He worked his fingers to the bone trying to provide for his family. He was the sort of person that we would often say tributes about in testimony meetings and in family gatherings. But one time, during one of our great family reunions, I heard the comment made by the relative that I mentioned that this racism was indefensible. It was inexcusable. There was no way to explain it away. There was no reason to sympathize with it. There was no reason to excuse it. There was no reason to try to negotiate it or engage in apologia. It was indefensible. And the man who was saying this, he was no heretic. He was no left-wing radical who was trying to fundamentally change the structure of the church. He would never have called himself an activist. In fact, he was probably the best connected to the church hierarchy out of everyone in our family, and he had held several high-level positions within the church. So when I heard him say that about such a good man within our family, I asked myself a hard question. How could a man who is so good, so respected, so loved, be so wrong about something so important? And this was a question that loomed over all of us. We all had to grapple with this relative's racism from an early day. And it's noteworthy, too, that at one point, he was taking a trip to Missouri, and as you will see, Missouri is symbolically significant in the history of race and Mormonism. On his way to Missouri, a relative said, "So, would you ever want your descendants to entertain the views that you now entertain? Would you want them to pass that on?" And he said, "No, I would not. This ends with me." So the idea that a person, or might even add an institution, could have tremendous potential, but even at the same time have an Achilles heel, have a deep and abiding weakness, that wasn't new to me. And ultimately, that's what propelled me down this path of research to understand the Latter-day Saints' tortured and difficult history with those of African descent. This presentation will be divided into three parts. First, we're going to talk about the history. We're going to get into the documents. We're not going to be talking about theories. We're not going to talk about hypotheses. We're going to talk about what the documents actually say. Secondly, we're going to be talking about the theology of it. How can we understand prophethood? How can we understand a covenant people? And how can we understand racism within the context of what the gospel teaches us? And finally, we will close with praxis. What does this mean? How can we apply this knowledge in our everyday interactions with not only those of the African American race, but also fellow white members of the church. First, history. We, of course, have to start with Joseph Smith among the saints. Now, it's worth noting, and this is a scripture that you all know, that the earliest revelation on how we should treat those of other ethnicities, it was in 1830. And none other than the Book of Mormon. All are alike unto God, both black and white, bond and free. How did this teaching manifest itself within the Latter-day Saint community? So when Joseph Smith founded the church, as we would learn, there was, and I quote, no special rule, unquote, as pertains to those of African descent within the church. But the same year that Joseph Smith founded the LDS Church is also the year that a famous abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, founded his newspaper in Boston, committed to the abolition of slavery in the United States. Now, that should tell you how hot of a topic slavery and race was in America at that time. And it's tempting and easy for us as 21st century Americans to conflate abolitionism with being anti-slavery. And that distinction is important if you want to understand the early days of Mormonism and slavery, because they're very different strains of thought. It's one thing to be anti-slavery, but it's quite another to be an abolitionist. So when Joseph Smith released the Book of Mormon, and it's clear that there was to be no exclusionary rule as pertains to those of African descent, at least among most Latter-day Saints, it met with some ambivalence. There were some Southerners amongst the Latter-day Saint community, and they had a certain amount of unease when it came to their interactions with African Americans. But one thing that they accepted was that the Book of Mormon was, in fact, the Word of God, so they were willing to go with it. And they were willing to respect what Joseph Smith had revealed to them. But there was a problem. You see, even though it was one thing to be anti-slavery and it was another to be an abolitionist, that distinction wasn't always easily discerned amongst those who consider themselves to be pro-slavery. If you were against slavery, then you wanted to end the slave trade immediately. That's what it meant to be an abolitionist. You didn't just want to end it gradually. You just didn't want it to fade away or hope that God would intervene at some point. Being an abolitionist meant that you ended it today, now. No compromises. You don't negotiate with evil. You don't negotiate with the evil slave empire. You end it today. And that was the equivalent of being what we would see as today as an Islamic fundamentalist, terrorist. That was a kind of radical thought that people tended to project onto abolitionists. Abolitionists were often associated with slave uprisings. They were the kinds of people who supposedly would sneak into slave communities and whisper words into the slaves' ears. And before you know it, you have a number of African Americans rioting in the streets and killing white people. This was the kind of discourse that surrounded abolitionists. So in 1830, 1831, the Saints moved to Missouri, which, as many of us know, was at the time a slave state. And there not being any special rule as pertains to African Americans, the Latter-day Saints were at least somewhat open to the idea of African Americans joining the Saints in western Missouri, but local forces didn't see it that way. And when they caught wind that the local Latter-day Saints were as at least open to African Americans as they claimed, it became the pretext for mob action. And when the Saints were ousted from Jackson County in 1833, that was on the short list of the causes. And there were other issues as well. The Latter-day Saints were saying some really overly kind things in the eyes of Missourians about the Native Americans, how they're a promised people, and how Missouri is the promised land, and that sort of thing. But when it came to African Americans, they said, before you know it, these Mormons are going to be bringing African Americans into the area, and they're going to be marrying them, and they're going to be having offspring. And is this really the kind of society that we want to have amongst our people? The Saints are kicked out of Jackson County. And this issue of race would be a specter, a ghost that would haunt the Latter-day Saints for several years to come. And Joseph Smith knew it. And he knew that at all costs, he needed to distance himself from the label of abolitionist. He couldn't be seen as somebody who wanted to end the slavery immediately. He couldn't be seen as somebody who might be winking at interracial marriage. So say whatever it takes, because the cost could be mob action if he failed to do so. So in 1836, April to be exact, and that month is significant, Joseph Smith releases a statement in the Messenger and Advocate, and in it he endorses slavery as something that is divinely inspired, and in fact it was a great protective agent for the Caucasian community. After all, he said, do we want these degraded people coming into our society and associating with our women? No, we don't. Again, this was all in an effort to deflect what was happening in Missouri. He could not run the risk of being called an abolitionist. In fact, Governor Daniel Dunklin, then the Missouri governor, sent a letter to W.W. Phelps and said, Mr. Phelps, your problems in Missouri are your problems, but just so you know, the job to prove that you are innocent of the charge of abolitionism, that's yours. You have a responsibility to deflect that. I can't do anything for you. Because in this republic, as he said, Vox populi, vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. So if you get called an abolitionist, Mr. Phelps, that's your problem, not mine. Good luck. So for several years, and by several years, up until 1970 or so, progressive, or at least self-styled progressive Latter-day Saints, embraced an idea that was called the Missouri Thesis. And that is that the priesthood restriction could be dated to the Latter-day Saints' persecution in Missouri. They're dealing with being called an abolitionist. They need to distance themselves from the African-American community, and therefore they offered to exclude African-Americans from the priesthood and from the church. Now, this is based in some truth. This isn't fabricated out of whole cloth. Not long after the expulsion from Jackson County, Missouri, W.W. Phelps, the editor of the Evening and Morning Star, which was the Latter-day Saint newspaper there, he said, okay, so I once told you that there was no special rule as pertains the African American community. Well, I was just kidding. What I meant was, we will not allow any African Americans into our midst. We will exclude them entirely. We will essentially be a white church. And as a side note, I use the terms white and black because they were contemporary to the time. I fully respect and acknowledge Brother Perkins' fantastic work on this. So Phelps, he sought to do this as a kind of boxing maneuver. And this played into the thinking of many historians, saying, okay, this is where we got the idea that blacks should be excluded from the Latter-day Saint community. But there's a problem in that thesis. And that is that Latter-day Saint leadership came from a large coalition of thinkers. There were a variety of views when it came to issues regarding race. Let's just go one by one, just to give you a sense of how different Latter-day Saints viewed those of the African American community. Parley P. Pratt, for example, wrote a history of the persecutions of the Latter-day Saints in Missouri in 1839 and 1840. He went out of his way to emphasize to all readers that the Latter-day Saints had such a minuscule number of African Americans amongst their membership that it was virtually negligible. You can dismiss it entirely. We are a white church. He wanted people to understand that. Orson Hyde made it clear to Joseph Smith that he was not comfortable with African Americans being emancipated from slavery and being allowed into the church as they had been. Zebedee Coltrane, he made clear his discomfort when he became acquainted with the first African American priesthood holder, Elijah Abels. W.W. Phelps, he had started out as something of an abolitionist, but then in 1834 he pulled a 180 and said, actually, we want nothing to do with the African American community. And while in Utah, he in fact defended slavery. And then Reese Price, he's the radical of the bunch. I have a certain fondness for him. He joined the faith in Cincinnati in 1842, and he was a committed, ardent, and diehard abolitionist. In 1850, when the census was enumerated, he identified himself, as far as his profession goes, as a theocrat. I am a professional theocrat. And then we have Elijah Abels. Who is this man? He's certainly one of the most important figures in understanding the history of the priesthood restriction, though hardly not the only important figure. He was baptized in Cincinnati in 1832, ordained to the priesthood in 1836. We have his priesthood certificate. This is not up for debate. He served a mission to Ontario, Canada in 1838, and ordained a man to the priesthood while there, and also had to dodge a tar and feather mob in the process. He returned to the main body of the Latter-day Saints, was ordained to 70 in 1841, and then moved back to Cincinnati the following year, where he served in the top-level leadership of the Cincinnati branch, and personally organized disciplinary hearings of white Latter-day Saints, and he was listened to as well as respected. Now, there were some issues where he was asked to primarily preach to the African American population, but that comes as no surprise to us, primarily because, as we know from comments from Joseph Smith, he often said, well, let's send an Arab to Arabia, or let's send a Frenchman to France. He often believed that you should preach to your own ethnic group. So the fact that Elijah Abels was ordained to the priesthood, that problematizes the Missouri Thesis somewhat, because he was ordained to the priesthood within a week of Joseph Smith releasing his statement calling blacks such horrible things and endorsing slavery. So you have Joseph Smith authorizing Elijah Abels' ordination 1 week, and then endorsing slavery and calling for the exclusion of blacks entirely from their community the next. But then we have the story of William McCary. And if Elijah Abels problematizes the narrative, William McCary throws a wrench into the narrative like most of us have never seen. So who was William McCary? He was a runaway slave, also a brilliant musician, very persuasive, very charismatic. He knew how to pull in an audience, and he eventually found his way into the Latter-day Saint communities. He had a certain fondness for the Latter-day Saint communities, and he often siphoned people from within the membership and created factions of his own. He arrives in winter quarters in spring of 1847. And he promptly marries a Caucasian girl by the name of Lucy Stanton, who was the daughter of a former stake president. Now, for those of you who know anything about interracial marriage and sexuality in the 19th century, this was a great example of playing with fire. William McCary, by being so willing to walk around with his white spouse, was asking for criticism at the very least, and in several instances, it was not at all uncommon for an African-American man to lose his life over such an indiscretion. McCary makes a comment upon arriving in the winter quarters community and marrying his white wife. He says of the Latter-day Saints, "Some say, there go the old N-word and his white wife," with clear disdain. Now, people remembered Joseph Smith, and they remembered that he had authorized the ordination of Elijah Abels. Further, they knew that Joseph Smith had a deep and abiding affection for Elijah Abels. This was a kind of friendship that endured for generations. They talked about it even long after Elijah's death, how good of a friend Elijah was to Joseph Smith and vice versa. So the Latter-day Saints remembered this, and they said, well, Joseph Smith was okay. He's passed on now, but we're really, really uneasy with this situation. And I provide this image for you because that is an original image of the meeting minutes that record him saying this. Of course, he's immediately ostracized. And the text says, today some of the sisters said that is the man that Brother Brigham tells his family to treat with disrespect. So certain members were saying, well, Brother McCary, yes, you found your way into our community, but just so you know, you're not welcome here. McCary approaches Brigham Young. He wants to see if the rumors are true. What does Brigham Young say? It's nothing to do with blood, for of one blood, quoting Acts 17:26, has God made all flesh. We have to repent and regain what we have lost. We have one of the best elders, an African in Lowell, a barber. Now he drops a few names there and comments that do call for some unpacking. But the most important aspect of this quote is he specifically endorses African Americans holding the priesthood. Later on in the meeting, he would say, the color of your skin doesn't matter to us, Brother McCary. Isn't that right, gentlemen? And then all of the other gentlemen. This is a large number of other leaders, including people such as Heber C. Kimball, George Grant, other respected members of the community. They all say, aye. That's true. Color doesn't matter to us. March of 1847. And there is the image from which I drew that transcription. Mid-April, Brigham Young leaves for the Great Basin, leaving William McCary and his white wife basically to their own devices. Now, William McCary, in fairness, he did nothing to help the situation, because immediately after Brigham Young leaves, he begins to marry a series of other white women, practicing his own form of interracial polygamy. Now, you're already married to a white woman, you're already winning the disfavor of white Latter-day Saints. Why not just marry a few more and see what it takes to push them over the edge? Well, he succeeded, and a white mob congregated and essentially chased McCary, as one man recalled, to Missouri on a fast trot. His wife, Lucy, followed close behind. Now, that is not a depiction of the particular mob action. I have drawn this from another mob action that would have resembled what it looked like. So how do the Latter-day Saints respond once McCary and his wife have left? Well, we know something about Parley P. Pratt's views, based on his earlier history of the persecution of the Latter-day Saints. And it is Parley P. Pratt who gives us the very first evidence of the existence of a priesthood restriction. He gives it to us when Brigham Young is hundreds of miles away in the Great Basin. Latter-day Saints are pressuring Parley P. Pratt and Orson Hyde, saying, "How dare you? What business do you have have... Is it still on? Okay. What business do you have allowing a character like William McCary into our community? He's clearly a sexual predator. He's exactly what we would expect an African American to be like. And here you are, entertaining them. How dare you? So Parley P. Pratt said, well, of course that's going to happen. He has the blood of Ham in him. And those who are descended from the blood of Ham cannot hold the priesthood. Now notice what he said there. The blood of Ham. He didn't say the curse of Cain. And this is a point on which Parley P. Pratt and Brigham Young differed quite significantly. Brigham Young was insistent in later years that it was the curse of Cain. Parley P. Pratt believed it was the curse of Ham. Which is it? Already we're seeing that the foundations of the priesthood restriction are, as Sterling McMurrin said, shot through with ambiguity. So Brigham Young, he returns to winter quarters in December of 1847. He said this is the place. He's had the great experience of starting up the Mormon experiment in the West, and he's coming to see how matters are. And one of the first things he hears about is the William McCary incident. Now, when Brigham Young was telling William McCary that he supported McCary's involvement in the community, and in fact, he even supported McCary holding the priesthood, which he did. You know, he had been ordained by Orson Hyde himself. Brigham Young, though, he had a line. He believed that as much as it was acceptable for McCary to be a member of the community, and even as acceptable as it was for him to have a white wife, he didn't believe that there should ever be interracial offspring. It's one thing if two people want to get married, but once you start having children, then that is something that has an impact on the human family and ultimately the eternity, not to mention the priesthood. Here's what he said. Now, you'll notice I have identified different phrases by different colors, and there's a reason for that. So we'll read through the whole thing entirely. If they were far away from the Gentiles, they would all have to be killed. When they mingle, it is death to all. So the first line, Brigham Young is saying that an interracial couple is worthy of death, which is obviously quite violent rhetoric. It's the kind of thing that people actually did in some communities. They made good on that rhetoric when African Americans and Caucasians intermarried. But then he follows it up by saying, if a black man and a white woman come to you and demand baptism, can you deny them? So he goes from threatening death to expressing uncertainty. But then he says, the law is their seed shall not be amalgamated. Amalgamated was a long word for basically an interracial marriage, interracial sexuality. Mulattoes are like mules, they can't have children. Now, this sounds like ridiculous thought in the 21st century eye, or the 21st century ear. But in the 19th century, this was the thinking of some of the country's leading scientists. One named Josiah Nott was immensely influential in helping to write up the 1850 census. And he made it clear, once whites, Caucasians, and African Americans intermarry, then you might as well just say farewell to the human race. So Brigham Young was echoing thought that was pretty common for the time. But then he followed it up by saying, but if they will be eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake, they may have a place in the temple. So I've entitled the slide, A Conflicted Brigham Young, because he is a man of two minds. This incident has clearly caused him to ask some very hard questions of his own racial assumptions. He couldn't understand exactly what to do with this. He believed in African Americans holding the priesthood, but he simply could not abide interracial sexuality. But even at this point, he has not gone so far as to say that African Americans should not have the priesthood. He's still conflicted. In fact, he says, if they will be eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake, not have children, they may have a place in the temple. So between December of 1847 and January, February 1852, Brigham Young hardens his views on race. He gives 2 speeches in front of the Utah Territorial Legislature and says, not only are African Americans suffering from the curse of Cain, but they are also fit for manual servitude. And I therefore endorse slavery in this territory. To quote him exactly, I am a firm believer in slavery, unquote. Oh, he did believe that slavery should be a little bit different in Utah than it was in the South. You know, the slavery in the South, it was barbaric, it was exploitative. Slavery in Utah ought to be benevolent. You know, it ought to be focused on the uplift of the African American race. But never forget that there's a racial order, he said. There are those who are superior, and then there are those who are inferior. And for the rest of his life, he continued to iterate these views. And you never see again the comments that he made either in March of 1847 or some of the comments he made in December of 1847. He did continue to repeat his ideas that those who participated in interracial sexuality or marriage were, in fact, worthy of death. And it's noteworthy that when the Act in Relation to Service, which was the slave law in Utah, when that was passed, there was a code included in it, a proviso saying that there could be no sexuality between Caucasians and Africans. Now, it's worth noting that in the midst of these discussions, Brigham did not go unopposed. There was a voice who said, actually, Brigham, I think you're wrong. Now, by this point, to stand up to Brigham Young and say, you're wrong, it took somebody with a little bit of spine, a little bit of confidence. And that was none other than Orson Pratt. In January of 1852, in response to Brigham Young's first slavery speech, delivered on January 23rd, Orson Pratt said, 1, it is not our job to enforce the curse that is upon African Americans. Yes, they're cursed. We all know that. But that's not our business, not our problem. 2, there was no revelation on this, Brother Brigham. We've never heard the voice of the Lord telling us that we should endure slavery. Why are you doing it now? And Brigham Young promptly follows it up by saying, well, now that you mention it, the Lord has revealed it to me. And you can find a full text of the February 1852 speech, the one in which Brigham Young says that the Lord has revealed it to me, in the second half of my book, including a transcription of the original Pittman shorthand. And that's actually where we get the comments from Orson Pratt. That is thanks to the tremendous work of Legene Carruth, who is our Pittman shorthand specialist over at the Church History Library. Until she did research very recently, we had no idea that Orson Pratt had said these things. So what happens from 1852 over the course of the next generation? We see that this priesthood restriction that began all the way with Parley P. Pratt seeped into the Mormon consciousness, into Mormon society, and eventually became entrenched in the latter part of the 1870s as well as 1880s and 1890s. In 1879, Elijah Abels approaches the brethren and says, I would like to receive my endowment. I am to be a welding link between the white race and the black race. I need my endowment. And they turned him down out of hand after a little bit of discussion, but as far as they were concerned, they didn't even refer to him as Elijah Abels in the minutes. They referred to him as a man named Abel, as though he were some kind of stranger, though he was no stranger. Jane Manning James, she was denied her endowment in the 1880s and 1890s. And it was around this time that the idea of a premortal explanation for the priesthood restriction came into vogue. Now, as early as 1845, Orson Hyde had said, yes, African Americans were, in fact, not as valiant in the premortal life. They kind of had sympathies for the devil. But he never went so far to say that it was that it led to the priesthood restriction. But by now, that old line of thought was being applied to explain a priesthood restriction. So we have theology that is morphing over time. And we actually see that Brigham Young, he forcefully pushed back against this thesis. He said, those of you who say that has something to do with premortality, it has nothing to do with premortality. Nothing. It's the curse of Cain. And anyone who says otherwise is just wrong. And he was even willing to say this to his brother, Lorenzo. So we're seeing that the explanations for the priesthood restriction are still fraught with ambiguity. Even amongst top church leaders, they can't quite decide. Is it the premortal life? Is it the curse of Cain? Is it the curse of Ham? They never went so far as to say we don't really know, but you can see this clearly in the variety of records. So the second part of this presentation focuses on the theology of it. What does this mean for Latter-day Saint theology? And an important aspect of the story that gets overlooked is the relationship between the prophet and the people within the covenant community. When we talk about race and the priesthood and race and Mormonism, we fixate on what church leaders say. We look at all of the comments that they've made. We keep a catalog, and we have a list of everything Brigham Young's said that's offensive and racist, and we rightfully get upset about it. But that's but a small slice of the story at hand. Prophethood, as I argue, is bounded. The ability of a prophet to be a prophet is not without some kind of constraint. We look in Mormon chapter 3, verse 16. I stand as an idle witness, Mormon said. I can no longer preach to them righteousness. Let not God speak with us. The children of Israel said, we only want to speak with you, Moses. And as a result, they ended up receiving a lower law. And as Joseph Smith said, the saints will fly to pieces like glass as soon as anything comes that is contrary to their traditions. There are many great and wonderful things we would all admit that God would love to reveal to us if we were willing to let Him. And it is for this reason that I argue, let me go back to that, for a thesis of collective responsibility. As we discussed earlier, the origins of the priesthood restriction were not even to be found with Brigham Young or any of the top leadership. They were at the most from Parley P. Pratt, and then, and only then, after he was heckled by a mob of white Latter-day Saints. As it happens, there were a number of voices who argued for a kind of collective responsibility. We have Sterling M. McMurrin, who referred to the collective conscience of guilt that the Latter-day Saints suffered for failing to uphold civil rights legislation. He called the priesthood restriction a quirk of things past that had endured because of Latter-day Saint complicity. John L. Sorensen said that church leaders had become followers of the masses, that they had experienced so much pushback from their attempts at carrying out initiatives that they realized we cannot force the Latter-day Saints to be anything they do not want to be. Lowell Albinian, he said, "It might be that you and I and all of us in the church, because of our sins, or because of our lack of thinking upon the great fundamentals that Christ taught, because of not having the Spirit of Christ, may sometimes be at fault for our limitations." Armin Maas, "Perhaps the chief deterrent to a divine mandate for change is not to be found in any inadequacy among the Negroes, as he called them, but rather in the unreadiness of the Mormon whites with our heritage of racial folklore." And of course, Eugene England said, "The Lord wishes a change could be made, and that we all bear responsibility for the fact that it hasn't been made yet." The vast majority of these Latter-day Saints would not be seen as terribly conservative Latter-day Saints. They all styled themselves to be progressives. And they felt that it was a Latter-day Saint community that shouldered the burden. So as Edwin Woolley once said to Brigham Young, and Edwin Woolley was another one of those men who was willing to stand up to Brigham Young, he said, "This is my church as much as it is yours. We use this as an anthem of empowerment, but we also need to use this as an anthem of responsibility." So finally, what does this look like in practice? We need to repent. And we all know the steps of the repentance process. Admit that we've done something wrong. Be sorry. Correct what we've done wrong, and don't repeat the error. What does this look like in terms of race? Admit a past of Mormon racism. That's the first step. Acknowledge that it's there. Don't pretend like it never happened. Because, as Brother Perkins said, we tend to be the last to recognize that. We need to express remorse, and that's not to say that we need to engage in some kind of self-flagellation. This doesn't mean that we need to go on the talk show circuit and constantly say, "We're sorry, we're sorry, we're sorry," but rather acknowledge our own racial assumptions and ask what we have inherited from the pre-1978 era. And most of all, never, ever repeat bad theologies or bad history. That's all. Thank you. Okay, this question. I understand that Elijah Abel's son and grandson were also ordained to the priesthood in the 20th century, but I have never seen any information on them besides their names and dates of ordination. Do we know anything else about them and their experiences? I do know some things about them. Elijah's son did have some trouble with the law. He was a bit of a teenage troublemaker. He ended up, facing some charges on occasion, and he had to pay a fine now and again. I have seen a picture of of one of his descendants, Enoch, and he looks a bit like Mark Twain, which is noteworthy, because Elijah's family, they were kind of enshrouded in a sort of exceptionalism within Mormon society. And as I found out from a descendant, when this descendant was an infant and his grandfather was holding him in arms, his grandfather said, "Ah, good, we finally got the black out of the Abels." Did Orson Hyde or Orson Pratt ordain William McCary? Orson Hyde did. You said Joseph Smith endorsed slavery in 1836, but you didn't mention that Joseph Smith campaigned for president on a platform to abolish slavery by selling public lands and purchasing all the slaves. That is correct. Later on during his presidential campaign, he did support the ending of slavery. He was what we would call a moderate abolitionist. He wasn't quite on board with William Lloyd Garrison, but yes, he did do that later on. In your view, how does blacks in the priesthood issue differ from the homosexuality issue of today, with its similar accompanying pushback? I am, in general, reticent to mix and match Mormon narratives. That is my general response to that. You can find some similarities, but you can also find substantial differences. The primary one being that we do, in fact, have a precedent for an African-American man holding the priesthood. We do not have a precedent for an openly homosexual practicing man holding the priesthood. In fact, we do have evidence that Joseph Smith strongly condemned homosexuality in no uncertain terms. I understand that, let's see, we've got that. So it sounds like you were saying there was no revelation on the ban, but rather some experience convinced them that African Americans should not have the priesthood. Is that accurate? Thank you. We do not have a single document that articulates a revelation for the priesthood restriction. That is correct. Brigham Young's 1852 speech is often referred to as the official original declaration of the priesthood ban. Do his thoughts tend to be presented in a political setting, or are there instances where he discusses in any detail the topic in general church meetings? In 1849, he mentioned it in a casual conversation with Lorenzo Snow, so he certainly was articulating it before 1852, in which he gave his thoughts before the territorial legislature. This question, it's asking about Indians who were dark-skinned as Africans and they were discriminated against. That is correct, because we weren't as focused on lineage in the 19th century church as we are today. If you were black, it was just assumed to be that you had African blood. Tell me if I'm going over time here. Two more. Okay. Slavery prevalent in the North, 20,000 slaves on Long Island in the 1860s, slave treated as property. Okay, I don't understand what the question is here, so I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pass over it. We'll do two more. How influential were the beliefs regarding blacks, the seed of Cain, of other Protestant groups upon the saints as they converted to Mormonism? The curse of Cain doctrine that belonged primarily to Brigham Young. He was a little bit unusual in that regard. Most people accepted it being as the curse of Ham. And then the last question, in winter quarters in 1847, when Hyde and Pratt answer that McCary has the blood of Ham, is there any pearl of great price connection to a priesthood ban? They do not cite the pearl of great price in their explanations, I can tell you that. So, thank you.